Hearthside Meadows was a peaceful suburb on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, known for its tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and rows of nearly identical craftsman-style houses. People typically moved here for the tranquility and the promise of neighborly goodwill. The Homeowners Association, for better or worse, governed everything from fence paint to mailbox dimensions. Residents lived with it, occasionally rolling their eyes at certain guidelines, but generally appreciating the organization. Among the quiet corners of Hearthside Meadows lived Ellen Whitfield, a retired elementary school teacher in her late 70s. She had a gentle manner and an open-door policy for neighborhood kids who wandered by with questions about her garden. Ellen's house was a modest single-story on Cloverberry Lane, boasting a small yard blossoming with roses, geraniums, and her personal favorite, lush potted ferns. She kept them on the front porch, carefully arranging them each spring so they'd soak up morning sun without succumbing to the harsher midday heat. The early morning rays of late April found Ellen seated in a wicker chair on her porch, sipping tea while listening to birdsong. She patted the broad leaves of her biggest fern, murmuring to it as if it were a dear companion. That was Ellen's way. She believed living things thrived on kindness, be they children, pets, or plants. Yet, even in this seemingly idyllic setting, tension lurked. An undercurrent of drama snaked through Hearthside Meadows in the form of Marjorie Butcher, or Karen, as many whispered behind her back. She was a middle-aged woman who served on the HOA board and took her duties to extremes. Every Tuesday and Saturday, one could hear the crisp click of her heels as she strolled through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on any sign of noncompliance. On this bright morning, unknown to Ellen, Marjorie was already stewing in a fresh wave of annoyance, specifically about the lineup of towering green ferns on Ellen's porch. Where others saw only a serene display of horticultural beauty, Marjorie saw an obstruction to her personal enjoyment of the sun. And it was only a matter of time before she turned her frustration into action. Marjorie Butcher had moved into Hearthside Meadows 7 years earlier, quickly securing a seat on the HOA board. She was in her early 50s but carried herself as though she'd commanded entire armies in a past life. She had an angular face with a perpetually pinched expression, hair meticulously coiffed, and a wardrobe of business casual outfits that looked more suited to a corporate boardroom than a suburban sidewalk. Unlike most HOAs that only acted on clear violations or major neighborhood issues, Marjorie took it upon herself to enforce every minor rule with relentless zeal. A mailbox color that was one shade off from regulation, a strongly worded notice was taped to the homeowner's door. Decorative garden gnome not listed in the official decor guidelines. Immediate penalty letter. Where previous HOA reps might have offered a friendly reminder, Marjorie jumped straight to threats of fines or mandatory corrective measures. Her peers on the HOA board sometimes tried to soften her approach, but she held significant sway, partly because she always showed up with meticulously highlighted versions of the bylaws. She seemed determined to shape Hearthside Meadows in her own pristine image, forging an environment free of personal quirks. Though many criticized her behind closed doors, few dared confront her publicly. She had a knack for flipping the script, casting herself as a champion of neighborhood integrity. Marjorie's house sat 2 doors down from Ellen's. It was visually identical to most in the community, save for the immaculate hedges cut into neat cubes and the high-end lounge chair permanently stationed on the side lawn. Here, on bright days, Marjorie sunbathed. Lately, she developed the notion that Ellen's large potted ferns somehow cast shadows that interfered with her ability to catch the morning rays. No one else would have complained about such a trivial matter. After all, the ferns were on Ellen's porch and didn't infringe on Marjorie's property. But when had logic ever stopped a self-styled Karen from stirring up trouble? With new purpose, Marjorie set her sights on Ellen's beloved plants. In her eyes, they had to go. That Saturday, Marjorie embarked on her routine inspection of Cloverberry Lane. Her footsteps echoed ominously against the pavement, clipboard tucked beneath her arm. She peered at each lawn, fence, and porch, stopping here or there to scribble notes. Finally, she arrived at Ellen's property, halting near the sidewalk to glare at the tall, leafy ferns arranged in terracotta pots. From Marjorie's vantage point, she confirmed her suspicion. The ferns were definitely large enough to cast elongated shadows in the early morning. She tapped her pen against her clipboard, frustration building. "This is an infringement on my right to sunlight," she muttered to herself. Ellen, seated in her porch chair, noticed Marjorie's presence. Hoping to be friendly, she raised a hand in greeting. "Good morning, Marjorie. Lovely day, isn't it? The birds are especially vocal today." She smiled. Marjorie barely acknowledged her. "Ellen," she said curtly, "I'd like to speak to you about these plants. They're quite tall." She said the word tall, as if it were an offense unto itself. Blinking in confusion, Ellen rose. "Yes, they're my ferns. I've been growing them for years. Do they bother you somehow?" Marjorie pursed her lips. "They block my sun when I'm trying to relax in the mornings. The shape of the porch combined with these monstrous ferns is not in keeping with the open, airy, aesthetic hearthside meadows aims for. I'd recommend moving them to the backyard or trimming them severely. The HOA guidelines do specify that landscaping should not negatively impact neighbors." Ellen felt her heart sink. She'd never had an issue with her plants before. "Marjorie, they're just potted ferns, and they're on my property, well within the porch boundary. They aren't encroaching on public space or damaging anything." Marjorie feigned sympathy. "I'm just giving you fair warning. They are indeed in violation. Flora that disrupts neighboring enjoyment of property or causes nuisance by overshadowing others." She flipped through her binder, as if hunting for the clause. "I'll be filing a complaint formally." Ellen was taken aback, but tried to remain polite. "I see. Well, thank you for letting me know. I'll look into the guidelines myself. Good day, Marjorie." She forced a smile and excused herself inside, feeling unsettled. In truth, Ellen had no intention of uprooting her beloved ferns. They were healthy, provided her porch a sense of calm, and gave her a hobby to enjoy in her retirement. Yet a knot of worry coiled in her stomach. She'd heard stories of Marjorie's ability to twist small rules into bigger punishments, and that fear was about to become all too real. Later that day, news of Marjorie's complaint spread through Cloverberry Lane. Ellen confided in her longtime friend and neighbor, Gloria King, a spry widow known for her outspoken nature and collection of garden statues. Gloria listened, arms folded, as Ellen recounted the morning's unpleasant encounter. "That woman needs a hobby, one that doesn't involve terrorizing everyone else," Gloria spat. "I bet half the houses here violate some nonsense bylaw, but she only goes after easy targets like you because she thinks you won't fight back." Ellen shrugged, trying to hold onto her optimism. "I've never had trouble before. The ferns aren't hurting anyone. I doubt the HOA board will force me to remove them just because Marjorie wants more sun." Gloria arched an eyebrow. "You'd be surprised. She manipulates those guidelines like they were her personal rulebook. I've seen her do it. She once fined the Reyes family for having an overly large doghouse when it was literally just a standard doghouse from the store." Ellen sighed, gaze drifting to her porch. "I don't want conflict, but I can't bear to lose my plants. They give me such joy each day." Word of the fern fiasco reached others on the lane, many shaking their heads at Marjorie's pettiness. In backyards, at mailbox huddles, and during casual evening walks, neighbors murmured that she'd gone too far this time. Some speculated about how to stand up for Ellen. Others worried about drawing attention to their own minor violations. Marjorie, meanwhile, was buoyed by the power she felt from lodging her formal complaint. She told her friend and fellow HOA board member, Carl Brunson, that she couldn't in good conscience let Ellen's greenery overshadow the neighborhood's open sun policy. Carl found the notion bizarre. The official guidelines mentioned no such rule, but Marjorie insisted it fell under nuisance vegetation. She even typed up a draft motion to bring to the next board meeting. Little did she know that her frustration, left unchecked, would soon escalate from petty complaint to outright malicious behavior. And the entire block, especially Ellen, would be left reeling in the aftermath. The following Monday, the HOA board convened for its monthly meeting in the local community center. Though the sessions were technically open to all residents, Attendance was typically sparse. People had better things to do than listen to procedural discussions about landscaping budgets and parking reminders. But Marjorie was there, early, with her binders and notes, eager to raise the issue of Ellen's plants. With a standard agenda finished, Marjorie cleared her throat. Before we adjourn, I have a matter of urgent concern. Resident Ellen Whitfield's large potted plants are negatively impacting my morning sun. The porch arrangement contravenes the spirit of our landscaping guidelines. She handed out a packet of papers, referencing specific sections about vegetation that encroaches or creates nuisance. Some board members flipped through the pages with mild confusion. David Park, the HOA president, frowned. Marjorie, typically we focus on plants that grow on sidewalks or property lines. These are potted plants, correct? On Ms. Whitfield's own porch. Marjorie stiffened. Yes, but they're tall enough to cast shadows beyond her porch. I've personally noticed the blocked sunlight. It's a matter of fair property enjoyment. David exchanged uncertain glances with the others. I appreciate your diligence, but this may be stretching the interpretation of nuisance vegetation. Let's table this for next month, do a quick check of Ms. Whitfield's property, and see if there's a real violation. Marjorie's lips pinched, but she forced a nod, internally seething. She'd expected immediate backing, but apparently the rest of the board wasn't as easily swayed by her dramatics. As the meeting ended, she packed her things in stony silence, planning her next move. She believed wholeheartedly that she'd been wronged. If the board wouldn't help, she'd deal with the problem herself. For days, she simmered over the perceived slight. Each morning, she'd step out to sunbathe only to see a sliver of shade creeping from Ellen's porch. She convinced herself the ferns were growing bigger, further intruding on her domain. Her frustration twisted into dark determination. The idea came to her almost spontaneously. If she couldn't forcibly remove them through the HOA, perhaps she could get rid of them by more underhanded means. At first, it was just a small, nagging thought. But as the days wore on, and her annoyance multiplied, that idle idea solidified into an actual plan. She recalled reading online that certain household chemicals could kill plants overnight. With a steady hand and a bit of stealth, she could solve her sun problem quietly, leaving Ellen none the wiser about who was responsible. It was extreme, yes, but so was Marjorie's conviction that those ferns had to go. A week after the HOA meeting, Marjorie meticulously prepared for her covert mission. She purchased a container of a potent weed-in brush killer from a store one town over, not wanting any local clerks to suspect her. She poured the substance into a discreet spray bottle, labeling it as window cleaner. Then she waited for the perfect opportunity. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops, the neighborhood grew hushed. Ellen typically turned in early, lights dim by 9 p.m. By 9:30, Marjorie was confident her elderly neighbor would be asleep. She pulled on dark clothing, a black sweatshirt, black pants, and a baseball cap to conceal her hair. Though her heart fluttered with nerves, her sense of self-righteousness propelled her forward. She slipped out of her house, crossing the short distance to Ellen's porch in near darkness. The only illumination came from distant street lamps. Carefully, Marjorie crept up the steps. The old wood squeaked slightly under her weight, and she froze, holding her breath. No reaction from inside. She exhaled with relief. The potted ferns stood there, silent guardians of Ellen's porch. Marjorie lifted the spray bottle, her hand trembling. She whispered under her breath, "Should have just moved these, Ellen." Then she squeezed the trigger, lightly misting the leaves with the toxic solution. She took care to spray each pot thoroughly, saturating the soil surface and base of the stems, ensuring the poison would be absorbed overnight. When she finished, she backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. She retreated into the darkness, returning to her own house with shaky steps. Only once inside did she allow herself to breathe normally. She'd done it. By morning, the ferns would begin to wither, removing the nuisance for good. If anyone asked, she'd feign ignorance. Who would suspect an HOA board member of such sabotage? Unaware that small acts of malice can lead to outsized consequences, Marjorie felt almost giddy with triumph. She believed she'd won a small but pivotal battle. Yet, like many acts of cruelty, her deed would soon unleash a wave of empathy and solidarity among those she sought to intimidate, ultimately turning the neighborhood against her in spectacular fashion. The next day dawned warm and bright, with a gentle breeze rustling across Cloverberry Lane. Ellen woke at her usual hour, eager to greet the day with a cup of tea on her porch. She smiled as she opened her front door, only to stop in shock at the sight before her. Her cherished ferns, once vibrant with lush green fronds, drooped and wilted alarmingly. The leaves bore a sickly yellowish tinge, while some had turned brown overnight. The entire row of pots looked as though they'd been starved of water for months, though Ellen had just watered them the previous afternoon. She stared, stunned, heart dropping as she took in the devastation. Gently touching one leaf, she felt it crumble between her fingers. Her eyes watered. "How on earth?" she murmured. Ellen was no novice gardener. She knew plants well, recognized the difference between dryness and chemical damage. Something about the suddenness of it all seemed suspicious. In all her years, she'd never seen healthy ferns degrade so drastically in a single night. Setting aside her tea, Ellen rushed inside to check if she had any horticultural aids that might help. She tried spraying them with water, trimming the worst of the leaves, but the damage was clearly severe. Tears pricked her eyes. These ferns weren't just decorations. They were living extensions of her passion for gardening, with years of love poured into their care. Soon word spread. Gloria came by, gasping at the sorry sight. "Ellen, this is unnatural. I've never seen plants turn like that overnight. Are you sure no one tampered with them?" Ellen pressed her lips together, a gnawing suspicion in her gut. "I can't prove it, but it sure looks like poisoning. Why would anyone do such a cruel thing?" She recalled Marjorie's complaint, but tried not to jump to conclusions. Could Marjorie really stoop that low? Neighbors trickled over, offering condolences, some bringing small potted flowers as tokens of support. The sense of shock was palpable. Though no one said it outright, many quietly wondered if Karen was behind it all. This sort of sabotage had her brazen fingerprints all over it. Ellen felt a swirl of grief, anger, and confusion. She had no proof, no cameras pointing at her porch. All she could do was grieve for her cherished plants, and hope whoever had done this would answer for their cruelty. Little did she know that her neighbor's empathy would soon blossom into a collective effort far beyond her expectations. By midday, the incident had become the talk of Hearthside Meadows. Text messages, phone calls, and social media posts circulated, bemoaning the cruel fate of Ellen's ferns. While a few neighbors were cautious about pointing fingers, others openly voiced their suspicion. Who else complained about those ferns? Marjorie was furious about them, wasn't she? Tracy and Paul Hibbard, a couple living across the street, had a doorbell camera that captured partial footage of the street at night. They reviewed it with hope of glimpsing some figure creeping onto Ellen's porch. But from that angle, nothing conclusive showed up, just a faint silhouette in the distance, possibly near Ellen's steps, but unidentifiable. Meanwhile, at the local cafe on the edge of Hearthside Meadows, a group of residents lingered over coffee, discussing what had happened. Gloria King was among them, her voice tinged with anger. "That old snake. I can't prove Marjorie did it, but who else has been so vocal about wanting those plants gone? She probably thinks no one will suspect an HOA board member." A younger neighbor chimed in. "We have to show her she can't bully people. Let's replant more for Ellen. If she can't have her ferns back, we'll find something else to fill that porch with green." The idea floated through the group, gaining traction. People were outraged. Poisoning someone's beloved plants was crossing a moral line. They wanted to stand by Ellen, who'd given so much to the community over the years. That afternoon, a small cluster of neighbors, led by Gloria, approached Ellen on her porch. They brought fresh ferns, potted geraniums, and even some small ornamental palms. Ellen's eyes welled up at the unexpected kindness. She still mourned her original plants, but the generosity lifted her spirits. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what to say. This is so kind of all of you." Gloria patted her arm. We take care of our own here. No one bullies Miss Ellen and gets away with it. Several others nodded in agreement. Unbeknownst to them, these gestures of solidarity were only the beginning. Outrage against Marjorie's presumed act would soon spark a much grander, more unified response, a response that would end up overshadowing her cruelty in a spectacular way. Marjorie was well aware that the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation about who had sabotaged Ellen's plants. Every time she ventured outside, she felt watchful eyes on her, silent judgments passing behind polite smiles. A few times, she overheard hushed conversations abruptly go quiet as she approached. Still, she held her head high, determined not to show any guilt or remorse. That same day, as she was retrieving her mail, Gloria King walked by with a pointed glare. Marjorie stiffened, quickly stuffing envelopes into her handbag. "Gloria," she greeted curtly. Gloria paused, crossing her arms. "Must be nice having all that sunlight without those big ferns in the way." Marjorie feigned ignorance, plastering on a look of perplexity. "I don't know what you mean. As far as I'm aware, Ellen's plants died from some disease or poor care. Perhaps she watered them improperly." Gloria's nostrils flared. "You're unbelievable. Everyone knows you wanted them gone. Now they're gone. Coincidence?" Marjorie gave an icy smile. "Accusations without proof are baseless slander, dear. I suggest you watch your words before you find yourself in trouble with the HOA for making defamatory statements." Gloria opened her mouth to retort, but Marjorie cut her off. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to." She turned and strode back toward her house, exuding an air of false confidence. Inside, however, her pulse pounded. She knew many suspected her, but so long as no one had concrete evidence, she felt safe. That evening, Marjorie typed an email to the rest of the HOA board, emphasizing the suspicious circumstances of Ellen's plants dying, subtly painting Ellen as incompetent in horticultural matters. She claimed the matter had nothing to do with the board, though she attached the same references about nuisance vegetation, as if to remind them that the issue still needed resolution from an official standpoint. Despite her outward bravado, Marjorie sensed the neighborhood's growing resentment. She told herself they'd eventually lose interest. After all, how long could they fuss over a few dead ferns? But she vastly underestimated the depth of affection folks had for Ellen, and their determination to fight back in a manner that would overshadow her petty sabotage entirely. After witnessing the heartbreak of Ellen's wilted plants, several neighbors decided a single wave of replacements wasn't enough. They wanted a lasting tribute to Ellen's passion for gardening, and a defiant statement against cruelty. Gloria spearheaded the effort, gathering a few avid gardeners in her living room one afternoon. They included Marie Thompson, who grew award-winning roses, and Ralph Peterson, a retiree known for his meticulous vegetable patches. Over cups of tea, they brainstormed ways to show their solidarity. Marie started, "What if we create a communal flower bed right by Ellen's porch? Something bigger and more diverse than just ferns. It would symbolize that we stand with her." Ralph nodded but scratched his chin. "A flower bed is nice, but we want to make sure it can't be easily tampered with again. If it's just out in the open, some unscrupulous person could sabotage it." Gloria's eyes glinted. "What about a greenhouse? A small one, built on Ellen's property. That would protect the plants. And we could all donate greenery, maybe a wide variety of species that thrive in greenhouse conditions." Marie's face lit up. "Yes, imagine a sweet little greenhouse in Ellen's backyard or side yard. She could walk in, tend to her plants without fear of them getting poisoned or messed with. And we could install a lock if needed." Ralph chuckled. "It'd be a direct response to the sabotage. Twice as many plants as before, all safe under greenhouse glass. The perfect gesture." They discussed logistical details, size, cost, permits. In Hearthside Meadows, any new structure needed basic HOA approval. However, as long as the greenhouse followed certain guidelines, matching the house paint or trim and staying within property lines, it should be permissible. And ironically, Marjorie's own fuss about proper structures could be used to legitimize this new addition. Gloria volunteered to talk to Ellen first, to ensure she liked the idea. Everyone agreed to contribute financially and with labor. Marie and Ralph would organize a donation drive for potting soil, seeds, and starter plants. A local hardware store might even give them a discount if they explained the cause. The group parted with renewed vigor. This greenhouse plan felt like the perfect retaliation, peaceful, constructive, and a shining statement of communal care. Should Marjorie dare protest, she'd face an entire block's resolve. Indeed, the quiet act of building a greenhouse would soon blossom into one of the biggest neighborhood undertakings Hearthside Meadows had ever seen. That evening, Gloria visited Ellen's home with a handful of neighbors in tow. They found Ellen sitting quietly in her living room, flipping through a well-worn gardening book. She still looked sad, and seeing her so downcast reinforced the group's determination. Gloria explained their idea. "We want to build you a greenhouse, Ellen. A real one, not just a token gesture. Big enough to house even more plants than you had before. We'll all pitch in money, materials, labor. Everything." Ellen's eyes went wide. "A greenhouse? That's such a big project. I couldn't possibly ask you all to do that." Marie stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Ellen's shoulder. "You didn't ask. We're offering. Think of it as a community gift, a way to turn something horrible into something hopeful." Ellen wiped a tear. "But it sounds expensive, and the HOA might not approve. We already had trouble with the ferns." Ralph gave a reassuring nod. "We'll handle the paperwork. The HOA can't deny a standard greenhouse if it meets the usual guidelines. We're not building an eyesore or anything. We want it to look nice, to blend with your property." Gloria crossed her arms confidently. "Besides, the bylaw for freestanding accessory structures is pretty clear. Keep it under a certain height, match the house exterior, and stay within the property lines. We'll do all that." Ellen glanced from one determined face to another, overwhelmed by their generosity. Finally, she smiled through teary eyes. I'd be honored. Truly, I never expected such kindness. My dear friends, thank you." They spent an hour discussing potential designs, small greenhouse kits available online, or custom frames from local handymen. They'd place it on the sunny side of Ellen's backyard, ensuring the best environment for her new collection of plants. In the days to come, more neighbors would learn of the plan and volunteer materials or labor. It was a blossoming wave of support, set to transform one act of evil into a horticultural triumph. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Marie Thompson drew up a preliminary sketch of the greenhouse, measuring roughly 10 feet wide by 12 feet long, with a small entry door and a vented roof for airflow. She researched climate controls, from simple fans to potential small heaters for cooler months. Ralph started contacting local suppliers for quotes on transparent polycarbonate panels and wooden frames. Gloria spearheaded the fundraising. She knocked on doors across Hearthside Meadows, explaining what had happened to Ellen's plants. Many neighbors already knew the story and were eager to chip in. Even those who weren't close to Ellen contributed small donations, $10, $20. A sense of unity permeated the neighborhood as they realized they could collectively stand against cruelty by creating something beautiful. Meanwhile, official protocols demanded that the greenhouse plans be submitted to the HOA board for approval. Gloria, who'd become a quasi-spokesperson, filled out the paperwork. A blueprint, color samples for the wooden trim to match Ellen's house, and a short description of the greenhouse's purpose. Marjorie, though no longer the only voice on the board, still wielded influence. The group anticipated her resistance, so they took extra care ensuring every last detail met the guidelines. The structure would be set within the required distance from the property boundary, remain under the maximum allowed height, and use house-matching paint to satisfy aesthetic rules. David Park, the HOA president, reviewed the application with mild surprise. "A greenhouse for Ms. Whitfield? That's quite an undertaking. Are you sure you want it placed in the backyard rather than the front?" he asked, a bit curious. Gloria explained politely. "Yes, for security and easier climate control. Also, to avoid overshadowing any neighbor's property. We want it to be fully compliant." David nodded. "Everything looks in order. We just have to wait for the next board meeting to make it official. I don't see any immediate reason for denial." Gloria felt relieved, though she knew one person would certainly object. But with the rest of the board on her side, and the entire neighborhood behind Ellen, there was hope. Marjorie might protest, but she'd likely be overruled. And if that happened, the greenhouse would be unstoppable. The time for the monthly HOA board meeting arrived. It was held on a Wednesday evening in the community center's small conference room. Usually, only a handful of residents showed, but this time, nearly 24 came, eager to see the fate of Ellen's greenhouse proposal. Ellen herself was there, supported by Gloria, Marie, Ralph, and others who had championed the project. Marjorie walked in with her usual aura of self-importance. Seeing the crowd, she sensed something was up. Upon scanning the agenda, she saw the item labeled Whitfield Greenhouse Request. Her jaw tightened. Once general housekeeping items were addressed, like scheduling the neighborhood garage sale, David Park announced the greenhouse proposal. He summarized the plan. Ms. Whitfield and several neighbors wish to construct a small greenhouse in her backyard. They've submitted all required documentation, ensuring compliance with our existing guidelines. He motioned for Gloria to speak. She kept her statement concise, highlighting how it would enhance the neighborhood's gardening culture, be aesthetically pleasing, and remain well within regulations. Ellen, looking nervous but determined, briefly explained how the greenhouse would help protect her new plants. The board members seemed receptive. One older gentleman even smiled, saying, "Sounds lovely. I see no issues." However, when David asked, "Are there any objections?" Marjorie seized the moment. She stood, clearing her throat. "I object on the grounds that Ms. Whitfield's previous use of large plants created nuisance. A greenhouse might encourage the cultivation of similarly oversized flora, potentially overshadowing adjacent yards or blocking sunlight. The plan does not specify maximum plant heights inside the structure. This is a slippery slope." Murmurs of disbelief spread through the room. David raised an eyebrow. "Marjorie, they've located the greenhouse in the backyard, away from your side. There's no mention of plants interfering with anyone's direct sunlight." Marjorie pressed on, citing tangential sections of the bylaws about maintaining neighborly atmosphere and avoiding potential hazards. She argued that glass structures could shatter in storms or attract pests. Her voice dripped with feigned concern, but her real motive was clear: halting Ellen's project. Finally, David put to a vote. Out of 5 board members, 4 voted to approve. Marjorie was the lone holdout. Applause broke out among the audience. Ellen hugged Gloria, tears of joy in her eyes. Marjorie seethed, slamming her binder shut. She masked her rage behind a stiff smile, vowing to find another way to sabotage this greenhouse scheme if it was the last thing she did. Approval secured, the neighborhood wasted no time. That weekend, volunteers gathered in Ellen's backyard armed with shovels, wheelbarrows, and enthusiasm. Marie brought the greenhouse kit, its many pieces neatly packaged. Ralph arrived early to measure and mark the foundation area, ensuring it stayed precisely within property lines. Ellen stood on her porch, watching the activity with a blend of awe and gratitude. Neighbors she barely knew showed up to help. A teenage boy who lived down the block offered his time, hoping to learn basic construction skills. A group of women from across the street provided snacks and iced tea, fueling everyone's labor under the warm sunshine. In the midst of hammering, sawing, and measuring, a sense of camaraderie blossomed. People chatted, laughing over little mishaps like accidentally stepping in freshly dug soil. Kids ran around, intrigued by the concept of building a giant plant house. Gloria and Marie worked to install the main wooden frame, carefully aligning each corner post. Ralph oversaw the polycarbonate panels, ensuring they fit snugly into the grooves. By late afternoon, the greenhouse began to take shape, a proud skeleton rising in the backyard. Marjorie, from her own home's side window, seethed quietly at the sight of so many neighbors united in a project she despised. She considered calling the city to complain about noise or code violations, but realized the group had taken every precaution. On top of that, it was daytime construction on private property, perfectly legal. Helpless, she could only glare at the budding greenhouse that threatened to double the green presence she had tried so hard to eliminate. Meanwhile, the volunteers wrapped up their first day's work tired but elated. They had most of the frame up. Over the coming days, they'd secure the panels, add ventilation, and place raised garden beds inside. With each step, Ellen's greenhouse grew closer to reality. And with each step, the neighborhood's collective spirit shone brighter, a direct contrast to the shadow of Marjorie's recent sabotage. One afternoon, as the greenhouse construction neared completion, Marjorie paced her living room. Her frustration had reached a boiling point. Every day, she saw more progress. Now the greenhouse had a little sign reading Ellen's Green Oasis, donated by a crafty neighbor. Worst of all, neighbors were praising the project as a heartwarming testament to community resilience. Marjorie fumed. She'd never been so thoroughly defied. The sabotage hadn't just failed. It had blown up in her face, igniting a unifying force instead of scaring Ellen into submission. If anything, there were more plants now, about to be housed in a permanent structure, and she could do nothing about it. Or could she? Flipping through the HOA bylaws one evening, she searched for any clause that could hamper greenhouse usage. She latched onto a line about maintaining aesthetic harmony with immediate surroundings and another about height restrictions for accessory structures. But these were moot, as the greenhouse was well within the regulated size. She found a reference to excessive greenery that obstructs neighborly view. But this greenhouse sat in Ellen's backyard, not out front. She could find no real wedge to exploit. Next, Marjorie mulled appealing to local city codes. She was disappointed to learn that small greenhouses were typically permitted, as they didn't count as permanent dwellings. She even considered reporting potential water runoff issues, but a quick glance at the city's guidelines told her that such a small structure wouldn't qualify as a drainage concern. With each dead end, Marjorie's desperation grew. She was used to bending the rules to her advantage, but in this case, the neighborhood had outmaneuvered her. The bitterness gnawed at her, fueling a vengeful desire to find some way, any way, to assert her dominance again. At times, a grim thought crossed her mind. Perhaps she could sabotage the greenhouse the same way she'd sabotage the ferns. But the risk of getting caught was far greater now. People were watching. Cameras might be installed. The greenhouse would be locked after hours. She was cornered. Ultimately, she resolved to bide her time, believing some unforeseen violation might emerge once the greenhouse was operational. She told herself, patience. They'll slip up eventually. This simmering resentment would linger in her, threatening to erupt at the slightest trigger. Over the next week, final touches transformed Ellen's greenhouse from a skeletal structure into a vibrant horticultural haven. Marie led a team installing raised beds along the greenhouse's interior perimeter, filling them with high-quality potting mix donated by a local gardening center. Ralph added shelving units on one side for potted herbs and flowers. A small solar-powered fan system was mounted near the roof to keep temperatures regulated during hot afternoons. Neighbors continued to bring Ellen an array of new plants, some purchased, others grown from cuttings. A wave of donated seedlings arrived: tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and various flowers. Even exotic species like orchids found a place in this new greenhouse environment. Ellen was overwhelmed, her eyes sparkling each time someone handed her a seedling or helped with planting. One day, a local newspaper reporter got wind of the heartwarming story. The seniors' potted plants were poisoned, prompting the entire community to build a greenhouse in response. She visited with a photographer in tow, snapping pictures of neighbors planting together, capturing Ellen's tearful gratitude, and writing up a piece titled, "When Cruelty Spurs Kindness, Hearthside Meadows Unites to Build Greenhouse." News of the article spread quickly. Residents who'd barely been involved now wanted to pitch in. Some donated funds for continued greenhouse maintenance. Others showed up to help plant or just to offer supportive words. The shared sense of purpose buoyed everyone's spirits. Everyone except Marjorie, who watched from a distance, her resentment simmering. When the final polycarbonate panel clicked into place, the greenhouse was effectively done. On that sunny afternoon, a group photo was taken at the greenhouse entrance, featuring Ellen holding a watering can while surrounded by smiling neighbors. The structure itself gleamed in the sunlight, a tangible symbol of love and defiance. Though Marjorie tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. The greenhouse stood as a triumphant testament to the neighborhood's unity, overshadowing her attempts to rid the area of oversized greenery. Far from eliminating Ellen's passion for plants, she had inadvertently multiplied it. The next Saturday, the neighborhood held a grand opening for Ellen's green oasis. Folding chairs appeared in her backyard. A simple wooden podium was set up near the greenhouse door. People arrived in casual attire, carrying potluck dishes and flowers. Someone suggested it felt like a mini festival. Music, laughter, and the scent of grilled burgers wafting from a nearby barbecue pit. Ellen wore a floral blouse, beaming as she greeted each visitor. She hadn't seen such a gathering in her backyard since her retirement party years ago. Children ran about, eager to peek inside the glass walls. As midday arrived, Gloria tapped a spoon against a metal watering can, calling everyone to gather around. "Thank you, everyone, for coming," she said warmly. "We stand here in Ellen's backyard, celebrating not just the greenhouse, but the compassion that built it. When someone tried to tear down Ellen's joy by harming her plants, we responded with something bigger and better." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marie took the stage next, her voice quavering slightly. "We can't erase what was done to those ferns, but we can ensure Ellen knows she's cherished. In this greenhouse, I see new life and new friendships forming. It's more than just a structure. It's a symbol of who we are as neighbors." Ellen stepped up to the podium, blinking back tears. "I can't begin to express my gratitude. The loss of my ferns broke my heart, but your kindness has mended it 100 times over. I hope to share this space with all of you. Anyone who wants to learn about plants or grow something of their own. My doors are open." Applause thundered. A few neighbors dabbed at teary eyes. Cameras clicked, capturing Ellen's radiant smile. Off to one side, Marjorie stood stiffly, arms crossed. She had shown up reluctantly, more to maintain appearances than to celebrate. She watched the crowd's joy with a sour expression, feeling like an outsider in a community that had rallied around the very cause she detested. To conclude, Ellen ceremoniously opened the greenhouse door, inviting everyone inside. A wave of people entered, marveling at the neat rows of potted herbs, the raised beds with flourishing seedlings, and the gentle warmth maintained by the sunlit panels. The scene embodied hope, overshadowing the memory of wilted ferns with an explosion of vibrant green. Despite the resounding success of Ellen's green oasis, Marjorie refused to accept defeat. Over the following weeks, she tried small tactics to reassert authority. She filed random HOA reminders about lawn edging and trash bin placement, hoping to entangle neighbors in petty rule enforcement. But her efforts backfired. People complied with minimal fuss, often mocking her behind her back. One afternoon, she spotted a neighbor, Sandra Lou, stepping into Ellen's greenhouse with a few pots of basil. Marjorie marched over, clipboard in hand, and barked, "We have regulations about communal usage of private structures. Are you leasing that greenhouse or paying Ellen? Because if so, that might be an unregistered business." Sandra, a mild-mannered mother of two, stared at Marjorie in disbelief. "I'm just leaving these basil plants for Ellen. She offered to help me start them. There's no business here." Marjorie bristled. "Nevertheless, we have guidelines about unauthorized expansions of personal property used by multiple households. I'll bring it up at the next board meeting." She stalked off, leaving Sandra bewildered and annoyed. Over the next few days, Marjorie kept harassing various neighbors who interacted with the greenhouse, implying it was commercial usage or that unchecked foot traffic violated safety codes. She hoped to foster fear and confusion, but the community saw through her. They recognized it as yet another attempt to sabotage Ellen's newfound sanctuary. Her complaints rarely even made it to the official board agenda. David Park and the other members dismissed them as baseless. A sense of defiance rose among residents. They refused to be intimidated. The greenhouse continued thriving, with neighbors dropping by regularly to admire the plants or donate seeds. Ellen, though unnerved by Marjorie's hostility, pressed on, watering her flowers each morning with a serene smile. After all, the greenhouse stood fully approved. No petty threat could tear it down. Frustrated and increasingly isolated, Marjorie's bitterness deepened. Her once subtle hostility turned sharper, spurring her toward a desperate, ill-considered plan, one that would culminate in a final confrontation with the entire neighborhood watching. Not long after her failed attempts to discredit the greenhouse, Marjorie decided on a more direct approach. If the greenhouse couldn't be outlawed or removed through official channels, perhaps she could harm it in a similar manner to how she dealt with the ferns. This time, though, she knew the risk, heightened vigilance, possible security measures. But her anger overshadowed caution. One evening, under the guise of darkness, Marjorie paced her kitchen. She had the leftover weed killer, that same potent poison. The memory of how easily she destroyed Ellen's plants tugged at her. Yet the greenhouse was locked at night, and cameras could be installed. She had no idea if any neighbor had set up a watch or if motion sensor lights might be triggered. Still, her resentment nudged her to act. She rationalized it with bizarre logic. That greenhouse, stuffed with new plants, was an affront to the neighborhood's open sun policy. She convinced herself that sabotage was justified to preserve the environment she wanted. Shortly past midnight, she slipped on dark clothing again, creeping outside with the poison bottle. She approached the edge of Ellen's property, scanning for lights or motion detectors. Indeed, a small floodlight was perched above the greenhouse door, but it seemed inactive at that moment. She weighed her chances. Should she risk it? Her heart pounded. She stepped forward, only to spot a faint glow inside the greenhouse. Was a light left on, or was someone inside? Anxiety churned her gut. She lingered near the fence, uncertain, when a sudden flash illuminated the yard. A motion sensor spotlight from the neighbor's house flared to life, bathing Marjorie in glaring brightness. Panic seized her. She scrambled back, nearly dropping the poison. With her cover blown, she turned tail and fled, half expecting someone to shout or chase her. None came, but the fear of discovery rattled her nerves. She retreated home, slamming her back door, chest heaving. It had been too close. Unaware of whether anyone saw her, Marjorie realized she couldn't keep this up without risking real consequences. She cursed the greenhouse under her breath, furious at being thwarted again. Meanwhile, inside the warm greenhouse, the plants thrived peacefully, thanks in part to the watchful eyes of neighbors determined not to let history repeat itself. The next day, word spread of strange activity spotted near Ellen's yard around midnight. The neighbor with the motion sensor spotlight reported seeing a figure scurrying away, though they couldn't identify them. Concerned about possible vandalism, a small group canvassed the block, asking if anyone else noticed suspicious movement. Ellen felt a renewed surge of anxiety. Could they be back to harm my greenhouse? She asked Gloria, her voice trembling. What if it happens again? Gloria wrapped an arm around Ellen's shoulder. We won't let them. We've come too far to lose now. Let's set up a watch, maybe with a simple camera, or at least a schedule of neighbors willing to keep an eye out overnight. Sure enough, volunteers stepped forward. One neighbor offered a spare security camera that could be mounted near the greenhouse. Another said they'd walk their dog late at night and pass by Ellen's yard as a deterrent. A third suggested installing additional motion sensor lights around the greenhouse perimeter. The sense of unity soared to new heights. People recognized that the greenhouse was more than just Ellen's project. It was a testament to communal spirit. Allowing it to be sabotaged would feel like letting Marjorie's cruelty triumph. Nobody wanted that. Marjorie, witnessing neighbors rally yet again, felt an agonizing sense of defeat. She realized that every attempt she made only strengthened the community's resolve. It was a situation she'd never faced before. Her usual intimidation tactics were powerless. Hoping to maintain a veneer of respectability, Marjorie publicly condemned the trespasser feigning outrage on the community's social media page. But many saw right through the act. Offline, hush-hush whispers circulated that she was likely the culprit. Lacking direct proof, however, no one openly accused her. Still, the air crackled with suspicion, and Marjorie felt it in every glance cast her way. With the greenhouse secure by cameras and watchful neighbors, Ellen's plants continued to flourish. Summer approached, bringing longer days and abundant sunshine that streamed through the polycarbonate walls. Delicate flowers unfurled, herbs released fragrant scents, and miniature fruiting plants began to bear produce. One weekend, Ellen decided to host a small green celebration, inviting neighbors to sample fresh produce from the greenhouse and see the progress. Tables were arranged in her backyard, displaying tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. People marveled at how vibrant everything looked, especially since many remembered the heartbreak of the poisoned ferns months earlier. In a corner of the greenhouse, Ellen placed a framed photograph of her original ferns, a quiet homage to the plants that started it all. Beneath the frame, a small placard read, "In memory of what was lost and the growth that followed." Families wandered in and out of the greenhouse, sampling bruschetta made with greenhouse-grown basil, sipping herbal-infused lemonade. Children asked questions about gardening, while older folks reminisced about how the neighborhood used to be less close-knit. "It's ironic," one remarked, "that something so negative triggered us to come together like this." Gloria approached Ellen, beaming. "It's a huge success. Look at all these smiling faces. We're basically a bigger, happier family now." Ellen nodded, brimming. Sometimes it takes a tragedy or an act of cruelty to remind us what matters. I'm beyond grateful. Marjorie was conspicuously absent, of course. Though she claimed to have a prior engagement, most suspected she simply couldn't stand seeing the greenhouse praised so openly. Regardless, the event proceeded without a hitch, another testament to the neighborhood's triumph over the shadow that once loomed on Ellen's porch. As summer wore on, most residents moved on from the initial scandal of Ellen's ferns. Their anger at the unknown saboteur remained, but in the absence of proof, there was little more to do. Ellen herself found peace in daily greenhouse visits, caring for her plants with renewed vigor. Yet, a lingering question nagged many. Would the culprit, widely presumed to be Marjorie, ever face consequences? Some neighbors quietly hoped to catch her in the act if she ever tried anything again. A few even discussed whether the police could be involved, but without evidence or eyewitnesses, an investigation would likely stall. Gloria was among those who refused to let the matter drop. She contacted the local police station, inquiring about the possibility of a formal complaint for the destruction of private property. The officer she spoke to was sympathetic, but explained they'd need tangible evidence, like camera footage, eyewitness testimony, or a direct admission of guilt. Frustrated, Gloria realized the moral victory of the greenhouse might be the best outcome they could get, at least for now. She consoled herself with the knowledge that Marjorie's reputation had taken a severe blow. Many neighbors barely tolerated her, finding ways to circumvent her petty complaints. Word traveled, even beyond Hearthside Meadows, that she was difficult, controlling, and likely behind the poisoning incident. David Park, mindful of the tension, arranged a community harmony meeting inviting all residents, including Marjorie, to voice concerns. The goal was to promote a kinder environment. Unsurprisingly, Marjorie's commentary fixated on minuscule rule infractions, ignoring the greenhouse issue entirely. Others calmly refuted her points, reaffirming the value of cooperation. By meeting's end, Marjorie was more isolated than ever, facing a round of polite but firm rebukes. While it wasn't an official condemnation, it felt close enough to leave her reeling. Perhaps this was the only justice the neighborhood would see, the slow but steady rejection of her toxic influence, replaced by a blossoming sense of unity she had unwittingly inspired. Late one afternoon, Ellen stood inside her greenhouse, checking on delicate orchid blooms. The sun cast golden rays through the panels, warming the space with a serene glow. She heard a tentative knock at the greenhouse door. Turning, She was stunned to see Marjorie standing outside, a strained expression on her face. Ellen's heart lurched, half expecting confrontation. She opened the door cautiously. "Marjorie, hello." Marjorie hesitated, glancing around as if uncertain. "May I come in?" Her tone was subdued, lacking its usual edge. Confused but polite, Ellen stepped aside. Inside, Marjorie's gaze swept over the lush greenery. She swallowed hard, a flicker of something like envy crossing her features. After a moment, she spoke softly. "This is quite an accomplishment. I never imagined it'd turn out so extensive." Ellen nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yes, it's been a community effort. We're proud of it." Marjorie fiddled with her handbag. "I wanted to apologize if any of my actions or complaints regarding your porch plants contributed to your trouble." She cleared her throat. "Not that I had anything to do with the poisoning, of course. But I realize it must have felt like an attack." Ellen's breath caught. She sensed this was as close to an admission of guilt as she'd ever get. She stared at Marjorie's face, looking for sincerity. It was hard to read, but there was a definite tension around her eyes. Managing a measured reply, Ellen said, "I do appreciate you acknowledging that your complaints were hurtful. Many of us still suspect more than that. But I can only hope you've come here to make peace." Marjorie's lips twitched, like she struggled with how much to reveal. Finally, she blurted, I prefer open space. My father had a greenhouse once, and it was a place of unpleasant memories for me. So I guess I resent seeing one here." Her voice caught, and Ellen glimpsed the faintest hint of vulnerability. "Ellen souffrant." She set aside her anger, recalling her own decades as a teacher who believed even the sternest soul could be wounded inside. "I'm sorry for your memories, but this greenhouse has become something positive for many. If you ever want to see how it can be different, you're welcome. You might find it's not the same as what you recall." Marjorie swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. She glanced around, as if searching for an exit from her own emotions. "Perhaps. Anyway, I said what I came to say." She abruptly turned, stepping outside without waiting for further response. Ellen exhaled, watching her retreat. She doubted Marjorie's hostility would vanish overnight, but at least there was a glimmer of remorse, or at least recognition of how outnumbered and isolated she was. Whether it signaled a real change, or just a reluctant truce, remained to be seen. Over the following weeks, Marjorie kept a lower profile. She no longer patrolled the streets with the same ferocity. Her email blasts about minor rule violations decreased. Residents, while still wary, noticed the shift. Some wondered if her guilt or personal issues had finally slowed her crusade. Ellen, for her part, continued tending to the greenhouse. Each morning, she watered seedlings, inspected leaves for pests, and sometimes just stood in peaceful silence, recalling how the neighborhood united to build this place. Her bruised heart over losing her original ferns had gradually healed, replaced by renewed vigor in her gardening life. One afternoon, a quiet knock came at Ellen's front door. She found a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a note scrawled in stiff handwriting. "I'm sorry. The ferns were truly beautiful." Enclosed was a photograph of a healthy potted fern, obviously from a gardening magazine, and a single pressed fern leaf. There was no signature. Ellen's breath caught. She suspected it was from Marjorie, though she couldn't be certain. Regardless, the gesture spoke volumes, an unspoken admission of guilt and regret. A tear escaped Ellen's eye. She placed the note and pressed leaf in the greenhouse, near the framed photo of her original ferns, quietly honoring the complicated path that brought them all here. The greenhouse, now teeming with life, stood as a testament to forgiveness, resilience, and community solidarity. Many neighbors began calling it the heart of Hearthside, a living monument to how quickly kindness could eclipse cruelty. Occasionally, kids from the local school visited for small field trips, learning about botany from Ellen. The legacy of the wilted ferns had blossomed into an ever-growing circle of positivity. Though no formal charges were ever brought against Marjorie for the poisoning, her reputation had changed irrevocably. People regarded her with cautious politeness, aware that something behind her steely exterior had cracked. In quiet corners, they whispered that the greenhouse had not only saved Ellen's love for plants, it might just have saved Marjorie from her own bitterness, too. The seasons turned, and autumn arrived. Leaves on the neighborhood, oaks blazed in reds and golds, while inside Ellen's greenhouse, a constant green, thrived year-round. She carefully adjusted the temperature and lighting, ensuring even tropical orchids survived the chilly nights. Neighborhood children eagerly awaited each new bloom, popping by after school for a glimpse of colorful flowers. Marjorie's presence in the community became less disruptive. She still held an HOA board seat, but her motions for stricter enforcement were half-hearted and rarely approved. David Park, sensing her mellowing demeanor, offered words of encouragement in board meetings. "We're here to serve the community, Marjorie, not to rule it," he reminded her gently. Meanwhile, the greenhouse served as a hub of good cheer. Ellen began a weekly open greenhouse hour, inviting neighbors to learn simple gardening tips or just enjoy the foliage. Some discovered new hobbies, like Gloria, who took up growing exotic peppers, or the teenage boy who started an herb corner to experiment with cooking. The once subdued block now buzzed with shared passion and collaboration. Looking back, Ellen often reflected on the journey. She still missed her original ferns, but recognized that their loss sparked something far more profound. Without that crisis, the greenhouse might never have been built. The community's bond might not have become so strong. A cruel act, meant to extinguish Ellen's joy, had instead ignited a collective sense of compassion, doubling the presence of greenery on Cloverberry Lane. One crisp afternoon, as she watered a row of blooming African violets, Ellen heard a sound behind her. Turning, she saw Marjorie standing in the greenhouse doorway. No clipboard, no scowl. Just a faint, unsure smile. Wordlessly, Ellen offered her a small watering can. Marjorie hesitated, then accepted it, stepping forward to gently water a wilted leaf. They worked side by side in quiet harmony for a few minutes. No apology was spoken, no forgiveness verbally given. But the hush was enough, a subtle acknowledgement of healing and acceptance. Outside the greenhouse walls, the neighborhood carried on, strengthened by this living symbol of resilience. And so, in a corner of Hearthside Meadows, where once an embittered neighbor had tried to eliminate a few tall ferns, stood a thriving greenhouse filled with life. Through it, the entire community learned that unity can flourish even under the darkest attempts at harm, and that sometimes the seeds of kindness sprout strongest where cruelty once tried to sow despair. Time flowed on in Hearthside Meadows, but the tale of Ellen's greenhouse lingered like a gentle fragrance. As new families moved in, they heard the story of how Karen once poisoned a beloved teacher's potted plants, only to spark the rise of a shared greenhouse twice as lush. The moral resonated. Ill will often backfires in a neighborhood determined to stand together. Ellen, surrounded by her flourishing greenery, passed her days content, forever grateful for the love her neighbors showed. Even Marjorie, still occasionally lapsing into bossy tendencies, seemed tamed by the greenhouse's quiet power. She never publicly admitted her role in the poisoning, but her subdued manner suggested an uneasy truce with guilt and regret. In the end, the greenhouse came to embody the very spirit of Hearthside Meadows. Visitors marveled at the riot of plants grown in solidarity, at the locked door that symbolized protective vigilance, and at the battered but framed photograph of those original ferns, reminding everyone how a single malicious act had led to something far greater than any one porch could hold. The old adage held true: from the deepest adversity can arise the most vibrant growth. And in the case of Ellen's greenhouse, that growth echoed through every leaf and bloom, a living testament that hope, kindness, and unity will always outshine even the darkest shadows.